Hey guys, and welcome to your next set of anatomy and physiology notes. Today is going to be all about not just the nervous system, which we started going over last time, but more specifically senses and the brain. So the major ways that your body interprets your senses, especially focusing on sight and hearing, and then also talking a little bit about some major areas of the brain, what they do and what do they control inside of your body. So let's get into the notes. Hold on, there we go, there's the right button. All right. So senses and the brain, how our body takes in and interprets signals that we get from the world around us. So the way that our body picks up on light or sound or chemical signals from different aspects of our world are tiny little cells called sensory receptors. There we go. So these are what our sensory neurons plug into in order to take that signal back to the central nervous system. So we have four primary human receptors. We have photoreceptors, chemoreceptors, mechanoreceptors, and thermoreceptors. And we're going to talk about all these a little bit today, but we're especially going to focus on photoreception that we use for our sight and mechanoreception that we use for our hearing. So thermoreception, just like it suggests, these are sensors that determine heat and coldness. They especially measure more so differences, so they can tell if one area of water or a solid or the room is hotter or colder than another area really well. Obviously, it's really hard to put your hand on something and go, ah, yes, this is exactly 72 degrees Fahrenheit. But it's really easy to tell, oh, this part over here is hotter than this part over here. So they're really good at getting those changes. And they send those signals through the peripheral nervous system. So all those little extra nerves that go out to your fingers and toes are picking up on these thermoreception signals. We also have chemoreception, which is where we take in chemicals from the environment. These could be taste. So taste is a type of chemoreception. The taste buds on your tongue are chemoreceptors. You can also have smell is another major chemoreception. So we have all these little receptors in our nose and our nasal passageways that pick out chemicals from the environment and send a signal to our brain of what those chemicals should smell like or what kind of scent those chemicals have. So our noses are pretty good. We can determine between about 1,000 different chemical signatures in the air. Obviously, some animals like dogs and cats have a lot more, but in terms of the overall general kingdom, humans have a decent sense of smell. So these smell and taste are both chemoreception, chemical receptors, picking up on chemicals floating around in the environment. So we talked about thermoreception, detecting temperature, chemoreception, detecting chemicals. The first really big one we're going to talk about is photoreception, or what we use for sight. So we have our eyeballs that are our primary sense organs in our head. The light comes into our eyes like so, activates a special region at the back of the eye called the retina that we'll talk all about in a little bit, and then sends light signals back here to the back of the brain. So your occipital lobe is on the back side of your skull, and this is the part of your brain that is responsible for taking in all the light information that's coming in and determining what sort of picture are you looking at. So we're going to kind of trace the major path that light takes through your eyeball and the major structures that it passes along the way. So on the very outside edge of your eye, we have the cornea. This is the part that goes like right in front of your eye that kind of protects the inside part of your eye from any dust or bacteria from getting in there. It also starts the process of focusing the light coming through the eye. We then have the pupil. So the pupil is like the black dot that's in the middle of your eyes. This little area right here is our pupil. And the pupil is actually just a hole. So it goes through, light comes in through the pupil to get to the inside part of your eye. So whenever you're looking directly at somebody's pupil, you're actually looking right into the inside part of their eye. The part that most people notice about people's eyes is the iris, this outside colored part of the eye. A lot of people like me have brown irises. Some people have blue. Some people have light green or kind of a light browny hazel kind of color. Some people are more kind of gray looking. But this iris is actually responsible for opening and closing the pupil. So it's sort of like a little muscle where when the light is really low, there's not very much light around, it will expand and make the pupil really, really big to try and take in a lot of light. Or if you're in a really well lit or outside in the sun, then the iris closes down the pupil, makes it really, really small so that your eye doesn't get overstimulated with the amount of light going in. So we've got our cornea kind of protecting over the front. We've got the pupil right in the middle, that's our little hole. And we have the iris going around the outside of the pupil, opening and closing that hole to let in more or less light. So we've got our cornea right here protecting the front of our eye. And then the iris would be these little reddish parts right on the outside. And then the pupil is this hole right here in the middle. So immediately after light goes through the cornea and passes through the pupil, it goes through the lens. And the lens is probably the most important part of your eye because the lens is what actually takes this light that's coming in and focuses it down onto the retina in the back of your eye. This is what allows us to get that nice, sharp, clear picture. When somebody like me, you can't really tell because I usually don't wear glasses, but I have to wear contacts in my eyes. That's because my lens is a little bit out of shape. And so the light coming in isn't getting focused correctly. So that's why when people have bad vision, that's usually the reason for it, at least assuming that they don't have some other problem with their eye, is that the lens isn't focusing the light correctly. So the lens is extremely important if you want a clear picture to be going through back to the back part of your brain, that occipital lobe that's back there. So the cornea kind of starts to focus the light, but then the lens is really what focuses it. And the lens is focusing the light onto the retina that's back here at the back of the eye. So the retina is the actual part of the eye that has our photoreceptors, that has the cells that are sensitive to light in different intensities and different colors. So the light comes through the cornea, it passes through the pupil and goes through the lens, which really focuses it onto the retina in the back of your eye. And this is what will get triggered in those photoreceptors and send the signal to your brain, or at least start the process of sending that signal to your brain of what you're seeing. So all of the little sensory neurons that are coming up to your eye in order to take in that visual information, those are all attached to the photoreceptors on the retina right back here. So the lens is right behind the pupil of your eye. It's right at the front part of your eyeball right here, but it focuses light onto the back part of your eye. So this light gets focused on the retina. Those photoreceptors get activated. And so they start sending signals down the little nerve cells that are connected to them. So here's your retina right back here. All of the nerves in your retina collect at a little area called the optic disc right here. So it's a tiny, tiny little part of the back of your eyeball where there actually are no photoreceptors. And so that part of your eye actually doesn't see anything. It's not getting that visual stimuli. Instead, that's just where all the nerves come together and bundle together into one big nerve called the optic nerve. So the optic nerve is right here. It's this big bundle of yellow colored fibers right in here. And the optic nerve is what actually carries this nervous system signal from the photoreceptors in your retina back through your brain and back to your occipital lobe at the back of your head. And so all of those nerves that are connecting to all the little photoreceptors in your retina, they all collect together and travel as one kind of big cord called the optic nerve back to your brain. And then in your brain is where you're actually interpreting the signals coming in and saying, okay, you're looking at a square computer that is black and has some stuff on the screen, and here are the letters that you can read. All of that is happening like that, almost instantaneously. So there's two major types of photoreceptors in human eyes that you may have talked about before: rod cells and cone cells. So your rod cells are what your eye uses to determine the amount of light that is in the air, whether it's a really bright area or a really dim area. And then your cone cells are what distinguish color. So humans have 3 cone cells: red, green, and blue. And all the other colors that we see are due to some different combination of the red, green, and blue cone cells, either firing and being activated or not being activated. So rods tell you about the light, cones tell you about the color. So C for cone, C for color. So just as an overview, we have light that's out here. It's coming in through the cornea. It passes through the pupil, our little opening right here. The iris on either side controls the size of the pupil. It then goes through the lens, which focuses it back onto the retina. So this yellow kind of tissue at the back here is the retina on the back of your eye. That stimulates the receptors, and then all that signal is taken out through the optic nerve to go back into your brain. And that is how we see pictures and images and light, by taking the light into our eyeball, activating those receptors, and sending those signals back to our brain. So that is photoreception, taking in light information with these light-sensitive cells. Our last major sense that we're going to talk about for this first part of the notes is mechanoreception, or cells being activated by some sort of movement, some sort of mechanism that changes the shape or size or direction of the cell, and that is what triggers a signal. So hearing is actually a form of this mechanoreception. We use vibrations in the air and pass them through our ear and through our eardrum in order to get information about the stuff and the sounds that's going on in the world around us. So kind of similar to our eyes, we have these sound waves coming through our ear, vibrating this little membrane, which vibrates these bones, which vibrates these little hairs in this snail-looking guy back here. So these tiny hairs in something called the cochlea, that's this guy. This is the cochlea. Tiny hairs inside your ear are what bend and tell you about the sound that's coming in. So let's talk a little bit about the specifics behind how a sound wave goes from the air around us into our inner ear. So the ear that we think of, or like when you see this floppy thing back here, this has a scientific name of the auricle. So the auricle, or the fleshy part on kind of the external part of your entire ear, is basically channeling the sound. So it's catching sound waves that are coming in and sending them down to what's called either the ear canal or the auditory canal. And kind of, it's basically acting like a sound funnel, funneling everything down to what's called the tympanic membrane right here, also known as your eardrum. So way down deep, close to your skull and your ear, is this thin little membrane called your eardrum. And when sound comes in and hits your eardrum, it causes it to vibrate. It causes it to move a little bit. So these sound waves come in, start moving your eardrum, causing it to vibrate back and forth. And your eardrum then passes those vibrations through these three tiny bones in your inner ear. So these are the smallest bones in the human body. They're called the ear ossicles. And these ossicles, or these tiny bones, take that sound wave from your eardrum and pass it along and vibrate it to this cochlea over here. So we have three little bones that all kind of interconnect with one another. We have the malleus, the incus, and the stapes. And so the malleus connects to the tympanic membrane, the eardrum. So that's kind of like the eardrum would be right in here. And then these vibrations so our eardrum starts vibrating back and forth, and it passes those vibrations through the malleus, through the incus, and through the stapes. And so these three tiny little bones are what connect our eardrum and the external part of our ear to the very internal part of our ear, actually inside of our skull right here. So like on this picture right here, you can see this is the bone of the skull. This is the brain right here. And so all this stuff is happening pretty deep inside of your head. So we've got this sound signal. We focused it from the outside through the ear canal and the eardrum and passed it through these three tiny bones. And so those three bones connect to this area called the vestibule up here and the cochlea, this swirly part down here. This is filled with fluid. So it's this little structure in here that's filled with fluid. And as these tiny ear bones vibrate, the fluid vibrates and it causes tiny little hairs inside that fluid to vibrate. So we go from the ear bones to the vestibule and the cochlea. And then inside of our cochlea, we have these tiny little hair cells. And when those vibrate, they activate sensory neurons, which all collect together, sort of like the optic nerve in the eye, only this is the auditory nerve in the ear. So all these tiny little neurons that run in through here inside of our cochlea all collect together into this one big cord of nerves called the auditory nerve. So when sounds are quieter and softer, these hairs will do small vibrations. When the sounds are louder, the hairs will do more vibrations. And over time, if sounds are too loud for too long, the hairs will actually become less sensitive. And that's why people who have to deal with really loud working environments or go to a lot of concerts when they're younger have hearing problems as they get older. Because not only do these ear hairs, these little hair cells, naturally stiffen over time, which is why old people generally have a harder time hearing, but they can also be damaged if they vibrate too much. So that is how mechanoreception for the ear takes these vibrations that are happening in the air and turns them into vibrations on a little membrane for the eardrum, the tympanic membrane, which vibrates the ossicles, that malleus, incus, and stapes that connect that eardrum to our cochlea right here, the inner part of the ear, where all these little hairs floating around in this fluid vibrate and send that signal down the auditory nerve to the brain. And the area of the brain that deals with these we'll talk about in just a little bit. So those are our four major sensory perceptions. We have chemoreception for smell and taste, mechanoreception which is used for hearing, photoreception, which we get through our eyes by seeing, and thermoreception, which is what allows us to be sensitive to different types of temperatures. So make sure you understand the basics of especially how light enters the eye and what the different parts of the eye do, and how sound enters the ear and what different parts of the ear do. That we're going to talk about today is the brain. This big organ that sits inside of our skull up here at the top of our heads and controls 99% of all the activity that happens inside of our body. So the brain is extraordinarily complicated. Obviously, we're not going to go into all the major details today, but there are a couple big parts of the brain that I want you guys to know a little bit about and be aware of. So in general, we can divide our brain into three major sections. You may remember this from the notes from the other week when we were talking about the central nervous system. We have the hindbrain, which is not the back of your head, but the lower part of your brain. We have the midbrain, which is kind of like the middle inside part of your brain. And we have the forebrain, which is the outermost covering part of your brain. So the hindbrain, like I said, it's not the back of your head right here. This is not it. Instead, it's this section right where the brain and the spinal cord meet. So you have your brain and you have your spine coming up through your neck, and right in the area that they meet at is called the hindbrain. So the hindbrain has a couple major different areas. You've got the medulla right at kind of the base of the brain and the spinal cord, which controls a lot of the automatic functions of your body. So like natural breathing, your heart beating, food moving through your digestive system, all that stuff is controlled by the medulla. Your pons, kind of a little bit further up on your spinal cord, controls different parts of your sleep. And your cerebellum, this weird kind of cauliflower looking thing at the back part of your brain, does a lot of movement coordination. And so what allows you to walk and talk and move your arms and legs in a synchronized manner, a lot of that has to do with help from the cerebellum. So that is our hindbrain, or our kind of lower part of the brain down here. Our midbrain is this kind of small centralized region of the brain. So remember, all this stuff down here is our hindbrain, but this little guy in here is our midbrain. Midbrain is essentially what reduces the amount of sensory information comes into our brain so that our brain doesn't have like a sensory overload. If your brain was trying to concentrate on 100% of your senses 100% of the time, your body would just shut down because it's too much information coming in all at once, constantly bombarding your brain. So instead, our brains have evolved to be very good at picking out things that seem like they're important and that we need to pay attention to, and kind of filtering out all the rest of the stuff. So your midbrain is what allows you to focus on what's important and filter out stuff that you don't really need to know or need to pay attention right now. Like, for example, Right now, I'm lecturing based on these notes that are in front of me. So I'm focused on my computer camera and my computer screen, but I also have a whole bunch of books and a bookcase over here and a whole bunch of papers over here, but I'm not really focusing on those or these. And so I can't really tell the names of the books that are over here or what exactly are the papers that are over here. My brain's not finding that very important right now. It's finding what I'm focusing on right in front of me to be the most important thing. So it's kind of filtering out all this extra information about some of the small details that are around us. And this is what your midbrain primarily does for your brain. Finally, we have our forebrain, which consists of basically kind of like the top middle part of your brain. So like this whole section up here is your forebrain. So we've got our midbrain is kind of right around here. And then our hindbrain is all these guys down here. Now the forebrain has a whole bunch of different interesting structures in it. We've got the thalamus, which helps with sensory information. We've got the limbic systems, which help control your emotion and behaviors. We're not really going to focus on those too much because the main thing that I want to focus on is what's called the cerebrum. So the cerebrum is this big, kind of the outside top part of the brain. Whenever you think of a brain and you think of all the gray, kind of wiggly lines going through it all, that is the cerebrum that you're thinking of. And so the cerebrum is where a lot of our more important thought and processing happens. And so for the forebrain, the main thing to focus on is this cerebrum down here, and specifically what are called the four lobes of the cerebrum. So we can split this top outside part called the cerebrum into four different regions, four different areas that we call the four lobes. So the cerebrum does a whole bunch of different stuff for our memory, our language, our activity, our sight, and stuff like that. And all of these are concentrated in one of these four lobes of the brain. So we have the parietal lobe, which is kind of right up here on the top part of your head. We have the frontal lobe, which would be like what's within your forehead and kind of the front third area of your head. We have the temporal lobe, which are on the sides of your brain. So these are kind of like the sides, just behind your ears, essentially, is where your temporal lobe is at. And then, like I mentioned earlier, we have the occipital lobe, or this area right at the back of our head, right here. So these are our four major lobes of our cerebrum, or also it's sometimes called the cerebral cortex. The frontal lobe, the parietal lobe, the temporal lobe, and the occipital lobe. So if there's anything that you remember about the brain today, I want you to remember about these four lobes. So here is a brain, and specifically the outside part of the brain, the cerebrum. So all of this going right through here is the cerebrum. And then here is our little hindbrain down here. So each one of these four lobes of the brain specializes in kind of a certain overall function, or some certain main important bits that the brain does. Our frontal lobe, right in the front here, is very, very important for behavior and emotion. So determining how we feel about stuff, how we respond to things, the emotions that we have in reaction to an event happening, whether it's really good news and we get excited, or somebody says something that's really annoying or mean and it makes us angry. And then we determine that we want to shout and jump with joy or hit that person or start crying because we're really sad. That is controlled by the frontal lobe up here. So a big part of how we behave and what our emotions are is controlled by the frontal lobe of our cerebrum. The parietal lobe up top is what processes a lot of our touch senses that comes in. So not just our ability to feel things with our hands, but also how hot or cold something is. So those thermo receptors that I was talking about earlier, all that information goes through the parietal lobe. So it helps us determine what is our skin feeling, what kind of sensations are we getting when our hands or our feet touch something, and how hot or cold are different areas that we might be experiencing. The temporal lobe, so here, let me kind of figure it out. So the frontal lobe would be kind of this part right up here. The parietal lobe would be this little guy right here. The temporal lobe would be this area right in here. And the temporal lobe is really important for things related to hearing. So this is where that auditory nerve goes into in order for your brain to process things that you hear in the environment. And going right along with that, it's also really useful for speech. And so being able to hear and understand what somebody is saying and then figure out how we want to respond back to them, how we're going to move our mouth and our tongue to create words and say things back to them, that is contained within the temporal lobe as well. And then temporal lobe also helps out with memory. So obviously a lot of memories that you have are going to be based on things that you heard or you were experiencing at a certain period of time. And your temporal lobe on the side here is what helps kind of classify things as short-term memories versus long-term memories and stuff like that. And then finally, right in the back here, we've got the occipital lobe. And if you remember from when we were talking about our senses earlier, the occipital lobe is extremely important for vision. This is where that optic nerve travels. So even though our eyeballs would be roughly like right up here or so, the optic nerve has to travel all the way back through the brain to the occipital lobe back here in order for a brain to start processing that visual information. And so people have actually done a really cool experiments where they've tested people's reaction to sound. And remember, sound and hearing go right to the temporal lobe. So our ears are right next to the part of the brain that controls sound. And they've compared those reaction times versus the reaction to something that somebody sees, which has a longer route for that signal to take. And so what they found is that your reaction to sounds is actually a couple milliseconds faster than your reaction to sight. And that's because that signal of the sound or the thing that you're seeing, the sound signal gets to your brain a tiny bit faster than the sight signal does, simply because it has a shorter distance to cover. So just some cool kind of side information there. But again, main thing to remember about the brain, and specifically, this is the forebrain that we're dealing with, is this cerebrum, this weird wrinkly wiggly part, specifically the 4 different lobes. The frontal lobe, which is important for behavior and emotion. The parietal lobe, which is important for senses like touching. The occipital lobe, which controls your vision and sight processing. And the temporal lobe, which plays a very big role in hearing and processing audio information, and then also recognizing and responding to speech. So that is our major set of notes for this second part of the nervous system, focusing on your senses, specifically your eyes and your ears, and then also focusing on your brain and a little bit on that hindbrain versus the midbrain and the forebrain, but really focusing in on those 4 major lobes of the cerebrum. So your assignment for this set of notes is pretty straightforward. It's essentially just a handout that asks you to identify a couple different points that are made in the notes. So let's go ahead and take a look at that really quick. Here we go. So let me zoom in a bit. So here is what your assignment for this week will look like. For the first part, it just wants you to identify those 4 primary human sense receptors that we have that tell us information about our world. It then lists the different structures of the eye, kind of in order that light will go through them on its way to sending a signal to our brain. And so for each one of these structures, just write kind of a short description that explains what that particular structure does. So what is the function of each one of these structures? So that's the second part. The third part for the ear, basically it's just fill in the blanks from what you saw in the notes, identifying the major structures of the ear that play the different roles that are specified within the little blanks around here. And then part 4 is the lobes of the brain. And so you just have to identify and name each one of the 4 different lobes of the cerebrum, and then write a brief explanation or description of what is the role of that lobe. What's its kind of main job as being part of the cerebrum and the brain. So 4 parts: sensory receptors, structures of the eye, fill in the blank for the ear, and the different lobes of the cerebrum. As always, if you have any questions, please do not hesitate to reach out. You can text my work number, you can send me an email, or you can upload your question on the Google Classroom, and I will respond to it as soon as I see it. Unfortunately, I'm not able to be on my computer all the time, but usually the notification gets sent to my phone that, hey, somebody left a comment on here. And so I do my best to get on that and reply to it, hopefully within a couple hours, but definitely within 24 hours of posting your question, you should get some sort of response from me. Once you're finished with the worksheet, whether you downloaded it and wrote in your own answers, or you wrote your answers down on a piece of paper and took a picture, you can upload that to the Google assignment. You can send a picture of those answers to me, or you can send me an email with your answers attached as either a document or a picture. All right, that's all that I have for you guys today. Remember, please, if you ever have any questions, reach out. I am here to help you. You can also come to the Zoom office hours if that helps you out too. But that's it for everything you need to know on the senses and the brain. And I will see you in a few days for our next set of notes.